How old is too old to rule? It's an interesting question, really. In a world where the maturing Gen Z is increasingly asserting itself onto the world stage, much of the activity from this young generational cohort has occurred on the continent of Africa as well as Asia. Oh dear God, the sheer amount of things that have happened here in the span of the last couple of months has been insane. I know there's going to be more stuff on the Gen Z protests because even at the time that I am talking about this, Madagascar just collapsed. And I just made a post about that because I don't even get a day off here. If you hear sounds in the background, those are my two dogs that are now running around the house like little spazzes. Now, regarding age, Africa in particular makes sense, because as a continent, Africa has the youngest median age in the entire world at just 19 years old, which is absolutely insane, considering how many different countries around the world are now suffering from aging crises, or at least are going to be suffering from aging crises in the next couple of decades. Africa is not on track for this at all. In fact, the IMF predicts that by the year 2050, Africa will contain 25% of the entire world's population. And for a young continent, you would think that they'd be electing primarily young leaders like the world's youngest serving state leader, Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, which we actually did a video on here before if you're curious about that. But, actually, Africa is home to some of the world's oldest leaders. And today we're going to be focusing on the world's oldest head of state and the longest continuously serving current non-royal national leader of the world, Paul Biya of Cameroon. Because again, if you were going to ever ask the question of how old is too old, this is probably it. But my friends, before we continue with today's story, I would just like to thank today's sponsor, Aura. Which is very important, mind you, because I'm sure that for any of you who are watching this right now, any denizens of the internet, you're probably wondering, why the heck is it that I keep on getting flooded with spam calls and emails and things like that? And the answer is because your information is being sold by data brokers out there online. That is why I recommend today's sponsor, Aura, to my friends, followers, and family, because they actually take care of the hard part, automatically removing your info from these sites and keeping it off. Because the thing is, Aura is so much more than just a digital security service. You get alerts if your personal info is found on the dark web, you get real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 monitoring to help keep your identity secure, a secure VPN, antivirus, password manager, and more, as well as US-based support available around the clock if something goes wrong. If something does go wrong somehow, you have up to $5 million in identity theft protection from Aura. So yeah, you're kind of covered. Seriously, there are so many bad actors out there on the internet, and considering how many people I have had that have made threats against me, my friends, my family, and more because of what it is that I do, I cannot let myself be vulnerable, and honestly, you should not either. Make sure to go to my link down in the description and try Aura for free for 14 days. Go to aura.com/historyofeverything, and just by trying it out, you can see for the first 14 days whether or not your data is out there on the internet. Please be safe, my friends. If there is anything that we have shown, the world is a dangerous and very complex place. But first, in order to understand things, we need to head back several decades for some much needed context, because Cameroon has an interesting story, and it has a lot of things to face. Cameroon as a region was initially colonized by the Germans back in the year 1868. There, they would use forced labor of the locals to run vast banana, rubber, palm oil, and cocoa plantations. Even roads, bridges, and other projects were made using the forced labor of locals. And honestly, when we described this was exploitative to the point that even other colonial powers would criticize Germany for these practices. It was far more intense here than you'd see in other places at the time. Moving on from that though, when Germany lost World War I, France and Britain would go and divide up most of Germany's colonies between them. It was always the smallest colonial power, but it still had a decent amount of territory that was granted to it by virtue of being a great state, at least for a while. They tried to sell the plantations to the highest bidder in London, but absolutely nobody wanted it seems. Eventually, the British, struggling to make a profit with all this African land, just ended up selling the plantations back to the original German owners. So yeah, that happened. Politically speaking, the country was split into French Cameroon and British Cameroon in 1919. The French, to their credit, actually did try to improve the infrastructure of their part of the country, and this time they actually paid their workers, which is a pretty distinct thing. The British would simply open up African maritime ports on the coast to encourage trade from the German plantations, and they also administered the territory from neighboring Nigeria, which essentially made them a colony of a colony, which honestly has to be one of the most depressing things that we've ever really described on this channel. Anyway, fast forward a couple of decades, and during the 1950s, there was a long guerrilla war that took place in French Cameroon due to the outlawing of the pro-independence party that existed there. Meanwhile, the main issue in British Cameroon was whether to reunify with French Cameroon or to join up and be absorbed by Nigeria. How come there was no guerrilla war in British Cameroon, you may wonder? Well, that is because the British had strictly forbidden even hinting at the existence of an independence movement. That was not going to happen. So on January 1st, 1960, French Cameroon would gain its independence. A year and a half later, on October 1st, 1961, the British would finally allow its colony in Cameroon independence after a UN General Assembly vote basically bullied them into changing their tune. Initially, the two were united as the Federal Republic of Cameroon with two distinct and separate governments, which this made Cameroon one of the first of the wave of African countries to shake off its colonial overlords, which became quite fashionable to do over the course of the 1960s in general. A decade later, in 1972, a referendum was held to abolish the federal system of government in favor of a new United Republic of Cameroon. Yet despite this change, it was basically still ruled by the same guy. Amadou Ahidjo would rule the country from 1960 to 1982, and during that time, he would pursue an economic policy of planned liberalism that aimed to merge the best concepts of capitalism and socialism as he saw it. Now, Ahidjo himself was an anti-communist, but he recognized the less humane aspects that had been seen under colonial capitalism that allowed individuals to suffer more compared to what he saw in socialism as the government working to provide economic equality to the masses, which is usually how those stories start out before it is that they go horribly wrong. This ended up in a confusing trend where companies were owned half privately and half by the government, which just sounds like one of the worst things imaginable looking back on it at this day and age, because over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, the economic policy proved to be absolutely terrible, and the government sought to privatize the mixed companies, hoping that the profits would end up in the hands of Cameroonians. Oh, hello there. Yeah, if you can see that's Millie. That's my dog. This approach was heavily influenced by economic nationalism, and the sad truth was, Amadou was just another African dictator. He claimed initially that he was going to lead the country towards becoming a social democracy, but within the first few years of his rule, it was very obvious that he had no intentions of actually doing so. Instead, he began an ad campaign positioning himself as the father of the nation. Of course. Yeah, if you look at the track record going back into the beginning of this guy, in 1962, he issued a decree banning any criticism of his regime. In 1966, he outlawed any political party but his own. And by this point, Cameroon was anything but democratic. His experimentations began and ended with the economy, but he was absolutely following the dictator playbook politically. He retained full authoritative control, and he would lock up anyone that would dissent. Yet in 1972, it was faltering health that actually caused him to pick a successor, a young man by the name of Paul Biya, which if you recognize that name from what it is that we've already described here from the beginning of this video, he would appoint him as prime minister. This surprised many Cameroonians, as Ahidjo was a Muslim and Biya was a Catholic. Most people looking at this scenario thought that Ahidjo would go and appoint Magari Bello Boba, who was a fellow Muslim from the north, like himself, but instead he chose a Catholic southerner. As for why he did this, some would go and speculate that Ahidjo planned to return to power once his health had returned, so this was something that was done as nothing more than a simple political maneuver. But he would not get his chance regardless. You see, in June of 1983, Ahidjo and Biya had a massive falling out with one another. Within a month, Ahidjo had escaped to exile in France, and Biya had already begun to purge his predecessor's supporters from his government. Both men would accuse each other of treacherous plots to gain control of the country once and for all, and in exile, Ahidjo would be sentenced to death in absentia due to 2 failed coup attempts, which Ahidjo was alleged to have orchestrated. For the rest of his life, Ahidjo would split his time between France and Senegal, where ultimately he would die of a heart attack in November of 1989, and that would be the end of him. Biya was now in charge. He would take control and immediately consolidate his power with a surprise election for president, which he stated would be held in January of 1984 instead of 1985 when it was originally scheduled. As for how this whole thing went, and remember, this is the guy who is still currently in charge of the country, he would win by somehow obtaining 99.98% of the vote, which is honestly so wildly outlandish and such a lie that it is amazing that people just didn't immediately start a revolution right then and there. Like, no politician in history has ever or will ever get 99% of the vote in any election. When you hear someone say that they won with over 90% of the vote, you should immediately be wary because technically, yes, it's not impossible, of course, but it is still so statistically improbable that it basically can't happen in any country without someone altering the vote tallying system, even in a one-party system. This is due to the margin of error where tallying votes will be usually around 1%. Similar results would occur in 1988 when Biya was re-elected in a one-party system of which he had complete control, and that is how it would pretty much proceed. Yeah, the whole thing was one giant sham. And of course, after receiving some international heat for his shady elections, Biya would take some steps to win international favor. He started by adopting a structural adjustment plan that was submitted to it by the International Monetary Fund, and this involved privatization, opening up the economy to competition, and reducing social spending. He also cut civil servant salaries by 60%, which, honestly, that could not have been a popular move. Under pressure from countries like the United States, he opened up the country to multi-party elections in 1990. And then, according to official results, Biya would win the first multi-party election the country had ever had in October of 1992 with around 40% of the vote, which is actually pretty reasonable considering that his nearest competitor actually took around 36% of the vote, but, at that point it didn't really matter because Biya had an ace up his sleeve. When he allowed multi-party elections, he made sure to not allow provisions for runoffs. So, Biya won anyway, even though he did not get 50% of the vote. It didn't matter if there were multiple other smaller parties that in the event of a runoff election, those smaller parties would have then thrown their support behind one candidate or the other. He made sure that wouldn't happen by just taking the largest amount of a minority. And so at this point, you might think, okay, well, that's not great, but okay, I guess this time he did win fair and square, so that's something, but oh no. Here's the thing. Every opposition candidate would claim that the vote was fraudulent. It would appear that Biya learned from his earlier, more ridiculous election tally claims and made percentages a bit more realistic this time, while still ensuring that he would win. It didn't matter if it was by 1%, he still had the largest vote, therefore he won. As for how his rule would go, throughout his time in office, Biya had been supported by France, which supplies it with weapons and training for its military. France would also invest more money in Cameroon than any other country, which is important to mention. Biya would also maintain a very close relationship between the state and Israel, which would supply them with armored vehicles as well as training from the IDF for Cameroon's Rapid Reaction Force. Students in Cameroon would be granted 11-month visas to travel to Israel and learn about agriculture. And poultry farmers were sent to Israel to learn about the ins and outs of poultry production. All of these things were done in the name of advancing the country. Biya was in charge when Cameroon would gain the dubious distinction of being the only nation in the world to side with Israel against the 2013 UN resolution for the assistance to Palestine refugees, which is not a great look. Either way, politically, in 1997 he would win with somehow 93% of the vote. In 2004, he would win the presidency again with 71% of the vote. And at this point, he was barred from serving as president again by a 2-term limit that was instituted in the 1996 Constitution. So all of these runs that he'd had before were totally legitimate, but after the 1996 one, instead of stopping him from being able to run, they basically went, okay, you were president all these other times, but now officially, from the moment we institute this rule, now it's 2 times and that's it. So you would think he would be done here at this point, but no. He had 7 years to figure that issue out, and soon he was expressing support for revising the Constitution in order to remove term limits. Because, of course. Then, Biya would set forth on an influence campaign within the National Assembly, which is Cameroon's version of Congress. Because he was the leader of the most popular party in the country, he wielded enormous influence over members of the National Assembly. If they crossed him, he could make sure that they were never allowed to run for office in the country again. And he made sure that they understood that this wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. The results? In April of 2008, the National Assembly would overwhelmingly approve the revisions to the Constitution that removed term limits for the president. 157 members of the Assembly voted in favor, 15 would abstain from voting, and only 5 people had the courage to stand against him. The effects of his influence were so thorough that the National Assembly would even vote for the president to have immunity from prosecution for his actions as president after leaving office. Not that that would ever happen, it seems. In February of 2008, riots would break out over rising prices, as well as calling for Biya to resign. These demonstrations were repressed brutally, and over 100 citizens were killed, with thousands being arrested. Biya would then subsequently win the 2011 presidential election with 78% of the vote, with his nearest rival getting 10%. Yeah, this rival, a man by the name of John Fru Ndi, was actually the very same guy that had gotten 36% of the vote to Biya's 40% back in 1992. He has tried to win multiple times with varying fluctuations in votes that don't really make sense, and to be honest, he must have been really pissed by this point. Wide-scale fraud was, of course, heavily suspected, and even the French and US governments discovered proof of voting irregularities. You don't say. Still, as far as international relationships go, the third leg of Biya's tripod of regime stability would have to be the United States. This is interesting, because in the early 1980s, Cameroon had sent most of its oil to the United States because the previous guy, Ahidjo, had preferred trading with richer business partners, which of course, makes sense, you want to get more money. But when Biya came into power, he diversified the oil economy, which he called cooperation without borders and open-door diplomacy. Now, initially, this harmed the relationship with the two countries, but Biya worked hard to stay in America's good graces so that they wouldn't come in and topple his regime for being just a little bit too shady for their taste, which is, considering history, there is a limit, but things will be allowed at times. This would prove effective during the War on Terror, as bilateral relations between the two countries would greatly improve as the two nations would conduct numerous joint counterterrorism actions against Boko Haram and the Islamic State's West Africa Division. Between 2020 and 2025, a small contingent of around 300 US military personnel would even be deployed to northern Cameroon to conduct regional intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance. Cameroon, actually, to this day, still faces problems in its northern region with attacks and kidnappings by Boko Haram, as well as high rates of youth unemployment and horrific road infrastructure, which some of these varying different terrorist organizations probably need to be videos in and of themselves. Anyway, in the year 2018, Cameroon would hold yet another presidential election, and I will give you one guess as to who won it. I'll even give you a hint. His first name is Paul. Last initial B. Wait, no, that's too easy. How about first initial P, last name Biya? Yep, the old man won again with 71% of the vote, as well as a heaping helping of violence, as well as low voter turnout. That happened, and that was 2018. Oh, wait, hold on. 7-year cycles. Oh. You can probably guess it here, my friends. At this point now, 7 years later in 2025, at the age of 92 years old, Paul Biya is running for his 8th term in office as president. That is actually happening right now. On October 12th, 2025, Cameroon would hold its presidential elections, and this time, Biya's biggest threat to his rule came in the form of Issa Chiroma, age 75. Now, Chiroma is a former railway engineer and candidate for the Front for the National Salvation of Cameroon party. He arguably stood a real chance of winning because he used to be part of Biya's administration from 1992 all the way to 2005, working as a government spokesperson. He knows how the government works in Cameroon and what changes need to be made. In fact, as of October 15th, 2025, the day that we are doing this, Chiroma is actually claiming victory already, even though the official vote counts haven't been released yet, though by the time this video comes out, it definitely will have. As for Biya, he is so old now that he frequently appears to not even know what is going on around him. He's rarely seen in public, and apparently he's married to the African version of Tammy Faye Bakker. Like seriously, no, go take a look at his wife. It's kind of wild with the hair and makeup. Biya regularly travels to Switzerland for private stays and medical treatment, while 43% of his country's citizens live in absolute poverty. Yet, he's built a political machine that is so fearsome and tightly controlled that it's pretty likely that he's going to win, even though his own daughter came out on video on social media begging the people to please not vote for her father. Yeah, just like most of the country's citizens, even Paul Biya's own daughter is bored and fed up with her father being the only leader the country has known for the last 40 years. But is that enough sentiment to overcome the massive Biya political machine? It's too early to tell, but it's very unlikely that it's going to be enough. No doubt, even at the time that I'm recording this, as this video is being edited, Biya is having his people alter results and fix the election. But if he does, Paul Biya might just make his regime the next one to be overthrown by Gen Z in what we're referring to now as the Gen Z fall, which includes Nepal and Madagascar as well as other countries. It could have been Indonesia at the rate that things were going, and who knows, it might even still be. This honestly needs to be a whole series in and of itself for what has been happening over the past year or so. And Cameroon is genuinely a good candidate for it. This is because, again, the median age in Cameroon is even lower than the continent's median age. The median age in Cameroon is 18 years old, not 19. So if Paul Biya fixes another election, he may very well also spark the flames of revolution amongst his people that have been seen all over the world. Cameroon's Constitutional Council has until October 26th to announce the final results of the election. So, when it comes to Paul Biya and the future of Cameroon, we can really only wait and see. With that being said, my friends, thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate it. Make sure to check out Patreon, where we're doing a series on the 7 deadly sins, which is not anime. We're talking about biblical ones and people in history who exemplify these traits. Either way, with that, my friends, we're going to be ending things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if there's anything else that you all would like to see, by all means, let me know in the comment section here down below. And don't forget, if you want early access to any of this, you can check it out on Patreon, where it is the second tier and above that gets access, or you can check out the YouTube memberships, where, again, if you want early access to this, you're getting this information now before it is that potentially any results have come out, because we have it immediately versus waiting 3 or 4 days for my editor to get it back to me. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Best of luck.